I Love South Africa with Samantha of Lismore. Hi, Samantha.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I thought first I'll just set the scene of first time I met you. And I remember it was the big Wines of South Africa tasting in London. And I was having one of those days where nothing tasted good. Maybe it was me, maybe it was the wine, I don't know. I was going through a very busy tasting and I thought, oh, I'm not going to find anything interesting this today. And then I came across your wines, and I always think you instantly know, oh, this is something special. This is, how come I don't know about these wines? And I think I remember saying to you, your wines are fantastic. And, you know, these are great. I think I tasted your Syrah. I can't remember which vintage. And I think at that point you weren't quite so well known, but now you're you've become one of the superstars of South Africa, let's say that. I think, in my opinion, you make some of the best wines. So it's sort of great to have you on for a Vinous Live. Where are you talking to us from today?
I'm talking to you from Somerset West in South Africa. I'm in a rented house temporarily here, and it's been very cold and stormy here in South Africa, so that's why I'm bundled up. We have snow on the mountains. We've had gale force winds, some sleet. It's been very dramatic the last couple of days in the Cape.
Yeah, I think we should talk about that later, actually, because we're in summer here. I always forget that in South Africa you're in the depths of winter. So yeah, so let's as usual, for people watching this, if you want to ask questions, do feel free to ask. If you can ask them at the beginning, it's easier, and I'll try and weave them into our conversation. I was going to do sort of like a first question, which was something along the lines of kind of, apart from not being from South Africa, working in a country where the government seemed to be against wine, trying to make wine during a pandemic, being out in the middle of nowhere, having to start from scratch, bringing up a family yourself, and having the inconvenience of a fire, what's the hardest thing about winemaking? Have I covered all of the bases there?
Sorry. Yeah.
Can we start from the beginning? Like, I mean, tell me tell me about your family, because you're originally from, is it Los Angeles?
Yeah, they're from just north of Los Angeles. My father was a surgeon who wanted to be a cowboy, and so very early in my life kind of took off to the Pacific Northwest and cowboyed the rest of his life. And my mother and stepfather owned a building business. And so I spent the weekends and the holidays in the Pacific Northwest on ranches with my dad, and the rest of my time north
of Los Angeles. He was literally a cowboy. What does that mean exactly?
He was a horseman. He really, all he ever wanted in life was to be a cowboy, and that's how he put it, and that's how he spoke to me. And so he had lots of cows and cutting horses, which is a very particular niche of cowboying in America, that has to do with cows. And yeah, I mean, he was a doctor just barely enough to be able to afford to be a cowboy, and so he spent most of his time going around and riding horses and working his cattle. And yeah, he was a really eccentric, interesting guy, a surgeon, cowboy, and a pilot.
Did that make his kind of love of the outdoors, is that something that's translated into yourself?
It definitely is. I very particularly remember being a typical 16-year-old from California, whining at him because I didn't want to be doing any of it, and I would have to clean the stalls and I would have to work on the farm and the ranch. And he said to me, "You will appreciate this someday. I know you don't see it now, but this is going to shape who you are." And I have a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old that I'm currently giving them that lecture. and my father passed away when I was 25, and I often think he's staring down at me, shaking his head. He cannot believe the life path that I have chosen, given the grief I gave him when I was 16.
Did he or your mother have an interest in wine when you were young?
Look, he's an O'Keefe. I'm an O'Keefe. You know, he enjoyed his wine and lots of other things, but not particularly. Wine did not really play a role. My parents, both sides, were entertainers. They always had people over. They really enjoyed food and the good life. And wine was always there, but it wasn't a singular obsession in the way that we in the wine industry live our lives. It certainly was not. Yeah. I actually remember one of my dad's girlfriends ordering, she loved a Johannesburg Riesling is what it was called, and it may still be called in California. And I thought she was so sophisticated.
But how did you, so you're in LA, but you didn't go straight into wine, did you?
No. So I sailed around the world as a student when I was at Berkeley, and I was studying development because I wanted to be Christine Lagarde. I thought I'd work for the World Bank and eventually run the World Bank and the IMF. I had very low ambitions. And after university, I made the decision to stay in Los Angeles to be with the boyfriend who had gotten into law school there. And I ended up working in television through my 20s. In that time, when I was at the Screen Actors Guild, I had a nice expense account, and we would always go out and drink nice wine. And then I moved on into a network where we drank lots of nice wine there as well. And that's really, you know, growing up in a family that loved the good life and loved food and drinks and just having people around. And then now you add that with the ability to afford really nice wines and be exposed to really nice wines. I think that's where it all began.
When you were working in television, were you in front of the camera, behind the camera? What were you doing exactly?
No. I was at the network. I worked for the Screen Actors Guild. My first job out of university was with the Screen Actors Guild. I negotiated business contracts, and then I went over to a network then that was called UPN. It was owned by Paramount. It doesn't exist anymore, where I was in the development department. So having nothing to do with in front of the camera at all. And at 29, I felt very lost. I'd gone so off track of where I thought my life would be. I thought I'd be, you know, trying to save the problems of the world. And so I quit, and I packed all of my furniture into a company that would ship overseas. And I told everybody I'd be back in 6 weeks, and I never went back.
They're still waiting back in Los Angeles, saying when she's coming back.
Yeah. My sister said when she dropped me off at the airport, she knew I wasn't coming back. You know,
oh, really?
That she just knew.
Yeah. So how did you sort of go from there to where does South Africa come in? Why South Africa?
So as a student, like I said, I'd sailed around the world, and I'd visited South Africa in 1992, and I called my dad.
When you say sailed around the world, is that literally in a boat sailing?
On a boat. Yeah, I was on a boat full of students, and it was a semester abroad, the way that some students will spend the entire semester in France. This sails around the world, and you're in classes while you're on the ocean, and then you land. And I still have dear friends all over the world from that trip. But we arrived, we actually had Archbishop Tutu with us on the boat from Brazil to Cape Town. And and we landed in South Africa, and I fell madly in love with this country. It was just so beautiful. It was a really tumultuous time. It was a really difficult time in South Africa's history.
What year was
right before 92.
Yeah, just before.
Yeah, for the people who don't know, to put it into context, you know, the first democratic elections were in 1994. Yeah. So I arrived as South Africa was about to vote on whether to give the majority population the right to vote. So, nobody was quite clear how that vote was going to go. And in the end, they voted to give everybody the right to vote. And as we know, in 1992, it became a new democracy. And by then, so I visited in 1992, and I said to my father, I called him at 3 o'clock in the morning his time and said, I'm going to live here someday. And I don't know that I believe that. But it is ironic when I look back on it, and I tell that story, that it was the only country of 13 that I called and said, I will live here someday. And I've, become a mother and a farmer and a businesswoman. And basically I've become an adult here in South Africa. So I've spent my entire adult life here.
Just to rewind a little bit before going forward, what was Archbishop Tutu doing on the boat? I mean, was he supposed to be on the boat? Had he got on the wrong boat?
He was in Brazil, and they arranged with him that we would pick him up in Brazil, because we were in Brazil as well, and give him a lift across the Atlantic to South Africa. And he
wanted to save a little bit of money, so he just thought, well, I won't fly. I'll just get on a boat.
Work his way home by lecturing to all these college students every day and playing ping pong with us,
Did his presence mean you had no storms or anything like that? It was very calm waters.
It's surreal to look back on it. It's amazing. And I know we were all blown away, but I don't think we appreciated the gift that we were being given at the time.
Yeah.
He was already a Nobel Peace Prize winner at that time. So that was amazing.
So then, let's go forward a little bit. So you're now, you when you went to South Africa, this is, you said like 92, and then you settled there from 92?
No. So then I went back to university. I graduated. I ended up in television at 29, which was in 2000, effectively. I left. I wandered around, but I ended up in Cape Town. And I've been here ever since. So I'm now 20 years in South Africa.
And what was the path towards winemaking and your winery?
So I arrived with my then boyfriend, who became my husband and the father of my children. And I wanted to stay. But like any immigration process, you have to have a reason to stay. And so we were looking, for what kind of business we might be able to open or what we might be able to do. And we got married and had our first baby, and I had this brand new baby, and I wanted to raise him in South Africa. And so we were looking at different business models, and we were invited to go look at a farm. And we didn't go there with the intention to buy a farm, but you've been there once, and we basically drove down that long, dusty road. And as you turn into Lismore, the mountains open up, and there's this waterfall in the back of the farm, and there was this big pond with water lilies, or they say waterbloemetjie in South Africa, and these slopes, and it was an old muddy dairy, and it was something that we could afford. And so
hopefully, I think we've got a photo that's just coming up now, hopefully, so because it is beautiful place, isn't it?
It is. So this is taken from a hill, a hill on the farm, looking down at what eventually became the vineyards. And in that ravine that you see, that very dramatic kloof, we say in South Africa, there's a waterfall there that feeds the river along the bottom of the valley. And so those slopes, it's deceiving because we're looking down, but those slopes are sitting at 325 meters above sea level. Mm-hmm. So, it's a dramatic sight, and it had a lot of potential, but it was just this really idealistic idea and a very idealistic dream. And there were dairy cows on those slopes. And where you see the house there on the hill, that was just a contour with dairy cows grazing on it. And this vision, we basically bought the farm. We did a lot of terroir research. It wasn't as completely naive as I sometimes make it sound, but we started planting in 2003, 2004. and built the house in the same years. And in 2009, Greyton, which is the area, the village and the valley there, became a wine of origin or an appellation because of what we were doing there, because the wines that are grown are so distinctive from anything else in South Africa.
Yeah, we've got a little map. You sent a map as well. I'll just try and bring the map up so people can see just where you're located, because it's amazing, because I remember, as you say, I went there once because it's in the middle of nowhere, and I remember I had a long day and there was a very long path, and I mean from Greyton to the winery takes, I think it was about 10-15 minutes or something like that, in a very bumpy road. And I was like, oh my god, when is this place going to appear? Because it must be one of the most remotest wineries I've ever been to, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but yours is the only winery in the ward of Greyton. Is that correct? Or
it's the only commercial winery. A couple of other kind of people have planted a block here and a block there. But yeah, it's the only commercial winery thus far.
Yeah. And so, like, sort of starting out, what was your sort of idea? I mean, what did you envisage your winery to be? What did you want to achieve?
You know, as I said, actually, the original vision was to just have a family business that I could raise the kids and we could all be together. And I'm sure I wanted to make great wine, but I don't know that I understood enough about site that I knew that the farm would be cool climate. I knew it would have, its own particular character, but I do think we planted a lot of Chardonnay amongst other varieties. And I think, in 2003, I think I expected to be growing in a California/Stellenbosch Chardonnay. I didn't have very lofty ambitions. And once the vineyard started producing, the Chardonnay, to just choose one, didn't taste like anything out of South Africa. Certainly not any California Chardonnay that I'd ever grown and that I'd ever tasted. And I had to quickly change my idea about what I was doing there. By then I was a single mom, and my ex-husband had moved on to do his own thing. And so I had the advice, the ear, and a lot of support from the winemakers in the Hamlin-Otter Valley. And so they really advised me to take a very traditional hands-off approach. And so that really started shaping the style of wine that I produced. But I mean, I can tell you, Neil, that after we met and your first report came out, and this is now, we bought the farm in 2003 and we're talking about 2013. Peter Allen Finlayson, one of my dear friends who you know very well, sent me a text message that your report had come out and I'd gotten some really nice scores. And I was sitting in the 5th grade school play in the dark. And I got this message and I just cried and cried and cried, because I had in that moment exceeded anything I ever could have imagined could come.
Make a lot of people cry.
Yeah, I know, I'm sure. I'm sure the other way, actually.
Yeah, the other way.
Yeah, with your mean words.
So actually, you hit on just rewind a little bit. How important was that when you were starting out? How important was that sort of community in South Africa, the winemakers, when you were starting out? I mean, because did anyone sort of say to you, what the hell are you doing starting a winery, in this? Okay, if it was in like a region that was more well known, like Swartland or Hamlin-Otter or something like that, I can understand. But sort of literally in the middle of nowhere, did you have people just saying this is a bad idea, or change your mind, go somewhere else?
Yeah, lots of people, especially, it's a valley. At that time, it was a valley of apple and dairy farmers. They all made sure to tell me and my ex-husband that it was a really stupid idea. And then the wine people that I met from Stellenbosch would really like make a face and just say, what on earth are you doing? That Greyton, like, that's just stupid. It's ridiculous. Why would you do that? But the winemakers in the Overberg, in the Hemel-Order Valley, in Elgin, in Balrefier, when I met them and I explained that I had planted vines in Greyton, they were like, that's so cool, you know, so tell me, what challenges do you have? What are you finding? You know, the thing that I don't know that many people understand is that vines weren't planted out there until about 40 years ago. And so everybody is a pioneer in their own right, trying new things and understanding the terroir there. You know, in the rest of the more traditional areas of South Africa, you have farms that go back generations and 300 years. But in the Overberg, everyone is pushing new boundaries and trying something new. And so without them and their support, with, you know, as I said, and shortly into this story, I all of a sudden found myself alone at the top of that mountain, and they were right there for me. They were encouraging me. I reflect on a moment when Peter Finlayson Sr. came to visit right after all that happened, and he sat with me and, you know, kind of like, what's your plan? What are you going to do now? And just with a brave face, I said, well, I'm going to stay here and raise my kids here and make this work. And he said, you know, if anyone can do this, you can do it. And I look back on that moment, and I think he could have very easily looked me in the eye and said, you need to go.
Yeah.
This is a hard life. You know, it is too hard for you. You need to take your small children and go. But he didn't. He said, you can do this. And I believed him.
So basically, they were as mad as you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they still are, all of them. Yeah.
But I think that's something that sort of, for me, distinguishes South Africa. You know, I've covered quite a few countries, and South Africa does have a kind of core of really kind of slightly crazy winemakers, but I mean that in a positive way, in that you've got to be crazy to, let's say, plant vines in that area or make wines in that way. But in a sense, that's what's changed the South African scene, because it's changed everyone's ideas of what South African wine can be. And I'm sure, like, before you came to Greyton, like, nobody maybe thought about making wine there. And lo and behold, you go and you produce some of the best wines in South Africa. Is it surprising to you that nobody, I mean, do you have that no other estates have sort of joined you in that area, or do you have all the best terroir in Greyton?
I in all seriousness, I hope that's not the case. I hope that I'm not Chateau Gruyere, and that, you know, I just found the one patch. The honest truth is that, first of all, it takes a very long time to decide if this was a good idea or not. I think, you know, all of South Africa and the farmers in my valley were sort of doing this, you know, waiting for the train wreck. And then once they realized it was a good idea, that's about now. It was probably only 4 or 5 years ago to where everyone just took a deep breath and a sigh of relief and said, oh, this was a really good idea, you know? But it's also a valley that has apples and pears, and the price of apples and pears right now is very strong in the world. Yeah. And so I don't see any farmer taking a risk on wine until that cycles out. You know, the reality is that, you know, for the same price of land, it's a very economic answer, and it's not romantic, but, you know, farmers are pragmatic. Yeah. And so, you know, that, and it's that type of climate, that diurnal temperature shift, you know, that produces really great wine, but it also grows apples and pears, and it's really profitable right now. Wine's hard.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, can you just talk us through, let's just talk a little bit about the vineyard and the grape varieties and the soil types just at Lismore. Can you just go through them?
So in doing the terroir research that we did, what we realized is we would have shale soils over clay, about 1.5 meters below the clay, steep slopes, a large diurnal temperature shift, as I mentioned before, and quite significant summer rainfall. And so this right here, this picture, we're looking out towards Cape Agulhas, towards the bottom of Africa. So we're standing at about 325 meters, looking south towards the bottom of Africa. So in looking at that profile that I just described, you know, basically we were looking at a profile very similar to the Northern Rhone. And, you know, the Swartland Revolution hadn't happened in 2003. No one was talking about the Rhone. Everyone was planting Bordeaux varieties, Sauvignon, Semillon, and the red Bordeaux varieties in the cooler areas. And so it was very risky and kind of out there for us to plant so much Syrah, which is what we did. And we planted a little bit of Viognier as a potential blending component. And then we planted a lot of Chardonnay because it was cool climate and because we were from California, and it was really as simple as that. And a little bit of Sauvignon because that's what everyone was doing. And, you know, in the end, all of the wines have really expressed themselves in a beautifully, but the Syrah and the Viognier were the two that had the most distinctive expression of place. And I think, you know, that analysis was spot on. And so, yeah, it's been really interesting to look back on what, you know, what we discussed then and what actually has really made its mark in the world.
Yeah, we got, as you sent, I'll just put it up, hold on a moment, I'll just get the, you sent a photo of the vine as well, so which sort of showed the soil. Yeah,
the Viognier, and that's actually the Viognier block. So, you know, it's really, really chunky gray shale over clay. This is the Viognier block early. This is a few years ago, so the vines were very young, but it's a great indication of the types of soil and the soil structure. You know, I have a soil consultant who helps me every now and then, and he said, you know, technically you actually don't have any soil in that block because soil is below a certain micron and it's just rocks, you know. Yeah, so that's, you know, I you know, there's so many things when I say how idealistic it was to do this, you know, it's a normal thing in wine to grow vines, dryland farmed and rocks, and yet imagine my neighbor farmers who are apple and pear and dairy farmers thought that we not only were going to plant on these steep rocky slopes, the worst place, not at the bottom of that valley that you saw in the picture where things are nice and fertile, but up on the steep rocky slopes, and we decided not to irrigate. So it's all dryland farmed, which is just crazy for a normal farmer. And we expected to give us fruit, and we expected to give us great fruit. You know, that it makes no sense at all. And I'm just very blessed that in the end, the quality of the fruit that came off those vineyards was something that, you know, people can enjoy.
What year did you actually build the winery?
So the new winery, I only built in 2016. I was very proud of it, as you know. I called it the Red Shed. And by then, for a number of years, I kept a bit of a low profile, and then all of a sudden I was ready to build like a big red shed, and I did. So 2016 was the new winery. I made one under my house for a few years, and then I actually rented space in big commercial wineries for 6 years before I built my own.
Yeah, but it was very, I mean, I remember visiting, it's a very sort of functional winery, isn't it? It's not like a beautiful sort of palace. It's a very sort of it is a shed, basically.
Yeah, it was a rectangle, and it was so functional because by then I'd made wine in enough commercial cellars to know what you didn't need, less of what you do need and more of what you didn't need. And so, yeah, I had this very functional rectangle with everything that I needed. It was an absolute amazing space. And, you know, I think knowing that I was coming back home closer to the vineyards, I'd have my hands on it. I think everyone expected that there'd be a marginal increase in quality in the wine, but I think really moving into 2017, it was an exponential increase in quality. Just having a space that was so, you know, the expression of the inside of my brain.
Yeah. And just inside there, I mean, can you just talk a little bit about the vinification you used? Because you used barrels, but you used concrete eggs as well. Just tell me a little bit about your ideas about, especially the concrete eggs, because I think that's quite important. For the idea, I think.
So, basically, as I said, we planted a little bit of Sauvignon Blanc and in 2003 because everyone was doing it. And as most people know, South Africa is known for more New World style Blanc, stainless steel tanks, reductive winemaking, very fresh and fruity. And when the vineyard started producing, I didn't know what to do with these grapes. I didn't like that kind of wine. I didn't drink that kind of wine. And frankly, I was sort of stuck with these Sauvignon Blanc grapes. And so I thought, well, I mean, come on, like in France, they just press the juice and put it into older barrels and make wine. I mean, might as well try it. And that's really how it began. And I did just that. And it was something really beautiful and really interesting. It was very outside the box for South Africa, especially at that time, which would have been about 2009. And some people didn't understand it, but luckily enough, people did. And what was so special about it is that it was textural. It was, it wasn't just fresh and crisp and linear. It had this rich, grippy texture. So over time, you see that I work with a lot of large barrels. As I could afford it, I moved into bigger and bigger barrels.
What size are you talking here, Sam?
Sorry, 500 liter barrels. Yeah. And then from 2016, I started experimenting with the eggs, purely for texture. And it was amazing. It was a bit too geeky, I think, for the Lismore style to bottle that completely on its own. But as a textural component, it was flawless. It was so cool. So those eggs in the back there are basically a 30% component of the barrel fermented Sauvignon. And it became 30% as of 2017. It was a 15% component before that. So I'm a big believer in the eggs, and not because they are trendy, but because in the two of my wines, the Age of Grace Viognier and the barrel fermented Sauvignon, they really add this underlying beautiful texture that I think is very much a signature of the Lismore style.
Just one question came in from Tim C. asked, where does the name Age of Grace come from?
It's a great question. In 2015, up until 2015, I'd only made wine from Lismore fruit. And because I had my own appellation, but because there was an appellation that I had made my name on, I wasn't sure how the world would respond if I made a wine from outside of that. But 2015 was a very dry and low yield for me. So I looked for Viognier vineyards that somehow could reflect, what my Lismore Viognier was. And I didn't find it, but what I did find was the same clone in rose quartz soil. So mine is that chunky gray shale that you saw, dryland farmed. Now I found this site in Elgin that was rose quartz, this pink crystalline soil in a similar climate area, but with a totally different soil profile. So I made the wine side by side, and in the end, they were so beautiful, but so different. And so I wanted to release it on its own. It was a risk, but lots of changes were happening in my life. And my name's Samantha Grace O'Keefe. That's my middle name. And when I was growing up, my friends called me Grace. And so it was the beginning of the next chapter. It was the Age of Grace. And think how cheeky it is to release two Viogniers in one brand, especially in South Africa. Yeah. And the Age of Grace has just taken, it's been such a success. And it really was a beginning of all the next big changes and amazing things that happened in the years to follow.
Yeah, just sort of staying on the subject a little bit. I mean, Nick Cooper asked a question about sort of the ageability of wines. He was saying that he had a 2012 Sauvignon Blanc recently, which was still drinking really well. And he said, were you aware how age-worthy your Sauvignons were when you first made them? Is that something you think about?
Well, all I can say is that when you make wine in when you make Sauvignon in that oxidative style, like I do, it doesn't turn to sort of tint asparagus in 6 to 12 months. And, again, I've been part of the evolution, not only of South African winemaking, but South African consumers. And it wasn't that long ago that a consumer would argue with you and tell you that if a Sauvignon hadn't been consumed within 12 months, it was going to be so off they couldn't drink it. And obviously that's not the case anymore, but by treating the juice oxidatively, I never had any worry, and I still don't to this day, that it will evolve in that way. It evolves with more texture, it evolves with more fruit, frankly, than it even has right after bottling. So yes, kind of.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been doing this long enough now. I have seen them age. But
Yeah. And then another question from Sid Cross came in about the diurnal temperature shifts between day and night. And he said, is that a big factor in the slow ripening of the grapes? Does it make you have a later harvest than other areas in South Africa?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It absolutely does. That's exactly what it means. I basically flower the beginning of the cycle at the same time as Stellenbosch, but I pick 3 to 4 weeks later. So, even though we might have some warmer days, those cool nights keep the cold units there, and it extends the ripening. One of the issues that we have in the Southern Hemisphere in hotter climates, like what people would think of as South Africa, is that often the sugars rise faster than the grapes can actually ripen. And what the result of that is just high alcohol wines if you let your grapes ripen to where they need to be. Where in a climate like mine, the sugars aren't spiking, so they actually can take their time, and the grapes can get to the point where they're physically ripe without having too high of a sugar and a much lower alcohol.
Now we have to talk about what happened at the end of last year, and you kindly sort of sent some photos of what actually happened. So if you want to sort of close your eyes when I put the photos up that you sent, I mean, feel free. But,
this is the first time I've ever shared these pictures with anyone, but I think 6 months later, I was ready to do so.
We've seen a photo of the winery when you first built it in 2016, but then let's do, hold on, just give me a moment, we'll put it, and we'll see tell us what happened at the end of last year.
So on the 17th of December, a fire came down that mountain that you saw, the first picture that came up. And a fire had been burning in the reserve about 10 kilometers away for 7 days. And threatened, it wasn't even near Lismore. I had no reason to believe that I'd ever be touched by it. And on the 17th of December, the wind shifted and it came down on top of us. And so the winery, the entire 2019 vintage, all of those soups were full of 70,000 liters of barrels. This is the exact angle of that beautiful picture you saw earlier. You can see the eggs in the background. All the wine is gone. All the barrels are gone. My house, everything in it. Basically, my children and I literally, it's such a cliche to say that we had the clothes on our back, but we had the clothes on our back. And my staff and I fought, but it was just too fast and ferocious. And yeah, everything was lost within a very short time. The vineyards were heavily damaged, and this is the 17th of December in South Africa. We start to harvest at the end of January. I would typically on Lismore start to harvest at the end of February, but we're barreling down into harvest and into season, and everything was lost within a couple of hours.
Yeah. How long was it between evacuating the property and the fire destroying, as you say, destroyed your house and destroyed the winery? How long was it between?
The minutes, I mean, we stayed. There were because the fire had burned for 7 days, there were helicopters in the valley. And so I think my staff of about 13 and I stayed way too long because we kept expecting the cavalry to arrive. And I don't know why they didn't arrive, whether the winds were too high or what. But, in the end, my staff was in my house. Each of them had taken a room. I was searching for staff that I didn't know where they were in this fire, and in my car was melting around me, and I didn't know, but they had each taken a room, and they all had buckets and were trying to pour water on the rooms of the house, and then the power went out because the cable burned, and when the power goes out, the water goes out. because the water is run by pumps. And so they realized they were trapped, and they crawled out from underneath the house and escaped. And we couldn't, there was no signal. We were trying to communicate. My foreman and I were sending each other like really primitive text messages, because eventually if they caught the right signal, it would go through. And the fire, once it had come down through the farthest of the vineyards away from the cellar and the house, I just said, everybody needs to get out of here. And so I went out one way in a neighboring farm, and they went out another way, and we met at the entrance to the farm. And in that moment, I thought all the vineyards were gone, my dogs, everything. The next day when I went back, and I realized that there was probably 50% of the vineyards that had survived, it really gave me hope that, I could rebuild and go on. But had the vineyards been completely destroyed like I thought they were, I don't think I would have been able to bother. It was the power of social media. There was someone there as the fire had already passed, and I had come into town, and they were kind of handing me beer and a tranquilizer, frankly. And I got a call from the UK because someone had put it on Twitter. And so it went around the world. I didn't even realize what had happened to my life, and the world already knew. It was very surreal. And I remember saying to Ross Dixie, who works for Hellgarten in the UK, and I just said, Wine of Origin Greyton has just been wiped off the map. Everything's gone.
Yeah.
And 2 of my dogs survived. 2 of 3 of my dogs survived. 2 of 4 of my cats survived, and about 50% of the vineyards. And thank God my staff and I did. My sons weren't on the farm at the time. And so, so here we are, and we need to just put our head down and rebuild.
Yeah. I mean, it must have been like it must have taken a lot of time for it to sink in what had happened. Is that right?
I don't think it has sunk in. Basically what happened after that is that, it's a week before Christmas, and again, the power of social media, I was so overwhelmed by the response of the world within hours. I didn't even know what had happened, and the way that people were offering help. And Alex Dale of Radford Dell, who is a friend and an amazing colleague, basically called me the next morning and said, everyone wants to help. Who's coordinating this for you? And I said, and he said, okay, well, if you don't mind, I'm appointing myself, as the person who's going to coordinate this. And he started building this spreadsheet of everyone's help. And, they basically put together a harvest for me. In the end, I took off, I didn't know at the time, but I was able to take off about probably half of the fruit, not of all the varieties, but of some of them. And my colleagues donated fruit, donated barrels, donated time, donated services, donated money, and donated cellar space. And in some ways kind of pushed me right out of this drama and crisis and trauma into harvest. And so I haven't really had a chance to even process it. Things just started to slow down after harvest. I made wine from all over South Africa, so the harvest was very long, and it kept coming in because everyone was offering me things. And it's only been in these last probably 4 weeks that I've been able to have any sort of perspective and just think about those first 2-3 days. My dogs that did live were burned. We were in shock. It was, and just like what a zombie I was, and frankly what a zombie that I was for the next probably 6 to 8 weeks. And how, if there's no way that I would have been able to pull together a harvest for myself. There's no way, not even a chance.
I think that's
if my colleagues hadn't kind of almost forced me, really just put it all together for me. Andrea Mullen, who coordinated the Cape Winemakers Guild end of that, and they all just kind of put it all together for me and threw me into it. And I wouldn't have made wine. And instead I did. And so now I'm able to kind of look back and I'm still in shock. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it is a sort of, I think one special thing in South Africa, like sometimes like I cover some wine regions, especially historical wine regions, where hardly anybody seems to have any contact with each other, or everybody's completely independent, hardly ever speaks to each other. Whereas in South Africa, it's a very much a sort of community. Everybody sort of helps each other out, and when somebody does have a crisis, and South Africa does have more than its fair share of crises, it is amazing how people will just instantly dive in and get you through a very difficult time so you can get through to the other side. And I think I remember with yours, I mean, I think that it was just after I'd done my end of year report, and I think I'd put your Syrah as my best sort of red or affordable red of the year, something like that. And literally it was 24 hours later and it was like, oh, Lismore is gone. That was the sort of crazy. But as you say, that's not, or as in all these things, as you say, the important word is perspective. And as you said about half the vineyards were not burned by the fire.
Yeah, I mean, the Syrah was heavily damaged, unfortunately, but the Chardonnay, a lot more survived, and I was able to carry fruit than really looked on first glance. The little block of Viognier that is the old block of Viognier survived, which is a miracle. I'd planted new plantings; they were all destroyed. But yeah, I definitely could never have imagined that the world had so much generosity and energy. I mean, the amount of energy that it took everybody to pull this Lismore harvest together, I mean, is incredible. And selflessness, that they all exhibited, it's incredible. And now it's up to me at this stage. Now it's time for me to rebuild and prove that all of that time, energy, money, and love and belief in me wasn't wasted. I have to come this stronger. Or I feel like I'll let them down.
So anyway, I mean, let's talk about the future a little bit. I mean, so a winery, you can rebuild as much as it's traumatic that it's burned down. As I said, it was a sort of functional winery, and there are plans to rebuild that. Yeah. The winery is definitely the easiest thing to rebuild, without a doubt. That should go up quite quickly. We are starting this week. I have a meeting tomorrow, and it's also just as far as my I don't know, the business attachment. I need it back. I need to know that my cellar is back and I can move forward. The vineyards, on the other hand, we're replanting now. As I said, we've had some pretty bad weather, but within the next couple of months we'll plant another 6 hectare. Some of the vineyards were definitely burned to beyond repair. I'm planting, so I've taken those out, but I'm planting adjacent to other blocks to just, while these come online, we can see how bad the damage is. The studies coming out of Australia aren't very promising when it comes to fire damage, but it's, we'll see. It was December, so it was right at a time we had huge rains afterwards, and those vines just pushed green leaves, and it makes you feel so hopeful that they're going to survive and they want to be okay. But the studies out of Australia say that within a couple of years they run out of reserves and they often don't make it. But we'll see. It's there's enough there. There's enough there to definitely make Lismore viable and to believe that we can move on. A cellar is just a building, and equipment can be replaced. Yeah. The loss of the 19 vintage obviously is a big hole in my life and my heart and my cash flow. But it is what it is. Yeah, yeah. And do you think, I mean, and will you rebuild the house as well? Like, that was just next to the winery?
The house, the insurance company is rebuilding. So it's just, I don't quite understand the logic of insurance companies, but they are going to project manage, and that's fine, because at this stage, I have a lot of things on my mind and a lot of things to think about. And so if they want to rebuild that house, then great. Yeah.
One stage at a time, I think, because it must be so much to take in all at once. And also, you were saying you had storms last night that kind of sort of caused more damage. Is that right?
Knocked everything over. And it's but this is the Cape, of course. It is what it is. It did. There were big, huge force with it knocked down, catastrophically damaged building, but we hoped we could use some of the pillars or some of the walls, and now they've all been knocked down. So, obviously it was meant, I needed a fresh start.
Yeah. And of course you've got the,
sorry.
So I had a bit of a delay there. And I was going to say, you've got the government helping as well by banning sales of alcohol in South Africa. So that must be great news as well.
This COVID thing. This
COVID
thing that kind of, just as my world had come to an end, the entire world came to an end. I mean, in March, when South Africa had its first shutdown, every single restaurant on the planet, I'm in 15 major markets and the biggest cities and culinary capitals of the world, every single restaurant on the planet that sold Lismore wine was closed. I mean, who could ever have convinced us that a year ago? I mean, there's no way that this could happen. And so it's just been so surreal. And as I said, the trauma of what happened in December, I feel like I'm just sleepwalking through more and more surreal scenes, And so the government, when they did their shutdown in South Africa, different to the Northern Hemisphere, when they locked us all in our house, they banned alcohol. Okay. So imagine that for all of you wine lovers. If you're watching this today, it's because you can't imagine living life without wine. It was very traumatic in South Africa, but they did give people warning. So you can imagine the queues at the bottle store and the rush, to make sure that everybody stocked up. So I think it was about 6 weeks, maybe even 8 weeks without alcohol sales here in South Africa. The first couple of weeks, we weren't able to export either. We weren't able to, they were trying to get us not even to go to the cellar and finish our harvest. That was a very desperate situation. But, as with the rest of the world, we phased out of that, and we were in a, state of suspension where you could buy alcohol, but you couldn't consume it in restaurants, but you were allowed to consume it in your home. And on Sunday night, the president announced that all alcohol would be cut off immediately. Like, you have no opportunity to restock your refrigerator or your cellar. And so, this is again, like new news. It's very fresh. It's very difficult for the South African wineries right now. I am a brand that is heavily reliant on exports. But there are many businesses, small businesses, that rely very much on the domestic market, and they haven't been able to sell wine properly since March. Yeah. Imagine the businesses that rely on the international tourists. Our industry, the wines producers directly employ over 300,000 people, and the alcohol industry, if we take it to the bottle stores and the restaurants, and we're looking at well over 1 million employees. And since March, we have so many people out of work and so many businesses that are struggling. It's been very hard,
Yeah.
But we've seen it in the rest of the world, but in our country, it just has been particularly aimed at the alcohol producers. And there's no differentiation between, beer, alcohol, or wine.
I want to ask, after everything you've been through and everything going on in the world, would you describe yourself as an optimist or a pessimist?
I think I am notoriously optimistic. I think part of that, there's a bit of like delusional optimism that I live in. I don't really look at the realities of all the negative. And a big thing in my life is if you don't have a solution, there probably isn't a problem, because I don't like it when people moan. It's like, solve the problem, and that's why this situation with the government regulations with COVID is a frustrating situation, because you can't just come up with a solution that can solve the problem.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm very optimistic. I was talking to a dear friend, another wine producer today, and I said, if I thought that throwing a tantrum and feeling sorry for myself would solve the problem, I would do it. but unfortunately,
after this interview, you can do what you want.
It's not going to get me anywhere.
Yeah. I wanted to ask. There was a couple of good questions that came in about. Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry. Just got a little delay. There was one question came in about from Roderick Ross about, after everything, has it changed your view on the style of your own wines, looking at coming vintages?
It hasn't changed my view of the style of my wine, but practicality wise, I made wine in 4 different cellars this season in 2020. I made it from vineyards stretching from Swartland to Constantia, to Elgin, to Stellenbosch and Greyton fruit. It's certainly, and I'm going to have to release it earlier, and just by the nature that I don't have a 19 vintage. I didn't have the type of equipment that I normally do. I didn't have my concrete eggs. I had a lot of donated barrels. I mean, you guys cannot believe how many trucks arrived with just older big barrels for me, but they weren't mine. So I think there certainly will be a shift in style in some of the wines. I think we might have some really pleasant surprises and see some great cool things that come from that. But the biggest shift obviously will be that the wines will be released earlier, and they might be a bit bigger. The one picture of that you saw of the burned cellar, I had big, large 5,500 liter fermenters, and just because of the situation I was in, a lot of the wines were made in smaller open fermenters this year, so they might be a little bit richer in style as well.
Yeah. Maybe just a quick, what's been the reaction from your customers? Have you heard from customers? So Philip Green asked that question.
No, the customers have been, all over the world. People they sent donations and messages, and still to this day, in the last couple of days, people are hearing for the day. Send me messages. In 2020, being a wine producer, you have relationships and connections.
I think we've just lost the connection there a little bit. Can you still hear me, Sam? Okay, I think we seem to have lost Sam there, but we were on the final minute anyway, so maybe hopefully nothing bad has happened down in South Africa. So, but it's been great to talk to Samantha O'Keefe, and I think it's a kind of a story of sort of keep going when everything seems bad. And I'm sure I'll be back to visit Lismore once it's up and running in its sort of second reincarnation. But anyway, thanks for everyone for joining us. And thanks, Sam, once again for sharing what's obviously been a very traumatic last few months, but I'm sure the future is going to hold some amazing wines, and I look forward to going back in the future. So